Tecumseh was a Shawnee warrior and visionary leader who fought to preserve Native American lands and unite the tribes against American expansion. Tecumseh, one of the most influential Native American leaders in history, was born in March 1768 near present-day Springfield, Ohio, in the heart of Shawnee territory. He came from a prominent warrior family. He had a commanding presence and natural leadership abilities that would define his life. Tecumseh's early years were shaped by conflict and displacement as American settlers pushed westward into native lands. He was raised in the traditional ways of the Shawnee people, learning hunting, warfare, and the spiritual beliefs that would guide his vision. When Tecumseh was only 6 years old, his father Puckeshinwau, a respected Shawnee war chief, was killed by white settlers at the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774. This traumatic loss would profoundly influence the young boy's understanding of the threat posed by American expansion. His older brother Cheesecow took responsibility for raising Tecumseh and training him in the ways of a warrior. The Revolutionary War brought further turmoil to Shawnee lands as tribes were forced to choose sides between the British and the Americans. Tecumseh grew to manhood during a period of relentless pressure on native peoples. By his teenage years, he was already participating in raids against American settlements in Kentucky and Ohio. He witnessed firsthand the destruction of native villages, the loss of hunting grounds, and the devastating impact of treaties that continuously pushed tribes westward. Unlike many warriors of his time, Tecumseh opposed the torture and killing of prisoners, believing such practices were beneath the dignity of his people. He earned respect not only for his courage in battle but for his principles and his powerful oratory skills. Tecumseh could speak with such force and conviction that he moved both his own people and even his enemies. He was not merely a warrior but a philosopher and statesman who understood that the native peoples faced an existential threat. The young Shawnee leader watched as treaty after treaty was signed and then broken by the Americans, as more land was taken, and as his people were pushed further from their ancestral territories. In the 1790s, Tecumseh fought in the Confederacy led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket against American forces in the Northwest Territory. The Native Alliance won significant victories, including the defeat of General Arthur St. Clair in 1791, one of the worst defeats ever suffered by the United States Army at the hands of Native forces. But in 1794, the Confederacy was defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers by General Anthony Wayne. The subsequent Treaty of Greenville in 1795 forced native tribes to cede vast territories in Ohio and Indiana. Tecumseh refused to sign the treaty, believing that no single tribe or chief had the right to sell lands that belonged to all native peoples collectively. This conviction would become the cornerstone of his life's mission. He rejected the very concept of individual land sales and believed that the land was the common property of all tribes, given by the Great Spirit, and could not be divided or sold piecemeal. This was a radical idea that challenged both American expansion and traditional tribal governance structures. As the new century dawned, Tecumseh began to formulate his grand vision. He would unite all the Native American tribes from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico into a single confederacy powerful enough to halt American expansion. He believed that only through unity could native peoples preserve their lands, their cultures, and their way of life. This was an ambitious and unprecedented plan. The tribes spoke different languages, practiced different customs, and had histories of conflict with one another. Many had already signed treaties with the Americans and were reluctant to risk what little they had left. But Tecumseh was undeterred. He possessed a charisma and vision that transcended tribal boundaries. Around 1805, Tecumseh's younger brother Lalawethika experienced a spiritual transformation that would prove crucial to their cause. After years of alcoholism and failure, Lalawethika fell into a trance and emerged claiming to have visited the spirit world. He took the name Tenskwatawa, meaning the open door, and became known as the Prophet. Tenskwatawa preached a message of spiritual renewal, urging native peoples to reject white customs, alcohol, and Christianity, and return to traditional ways. The Prophet's religious movement attracted followers from many tribes, giving Tecumseh a spiritual foundation for his political and military confederacy. In 1808, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa established Prophetstown at the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers in Indiana Territory. The settlement became a gathering place for warriors and believers from numerous tribes, a symbol of pan-Indian unity. Tecumseh used Prophetstown as his base as he embarked on extensive travels to recruit tribes to his Confederacy. He journeyed thousands of miles, from the Great Lakes to the Deep South, delivering impassioned speeches that called for unity and resistance. He visited the Wyandot, the Delaware, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Winnebago, the Sac and Fox, the Kickapoo, the Creek, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw. His message was consistent and powerful: the Americans would never stop taking land unless all tribes stood together. He argued that individual treaties were illegitimate because the land belonged to all native peoples collectively, not to individual tribes or chiefs who could sell it away. Tecumseh's eloquence was legendary. Even those who opposed him acknowledged the power of his words and the force of his personality. The American territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, recognized Tecumseh as a significant threat to American expansion. Harrison had been aggressively negotiating treaties with individual tribes, acquiring millions of acres of native land through a combination of pressure, alcohol, and exploitation of tribal divisions. In 1809, Harrison negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne, in which several tribes ceded 3 million acres of land in Indiana and Illinois. Tecumseh was outraged. He traveled to meet Harrison at the territorial capital of Vincennes in August 1810. The meeting was tense and dramatic. Tecumseh denounced the treaty as illegitimate and warned Harrison that he would resist any American attempts to settle the ceded lands. He declared that the land belonged to all tribes in common and that no single tribe had the authority to sell it. Harrison responded that individual tribes were sovereign and could negotiate their own treaties. The two men could not find common ground. They represented fundamentally incompatible visions of the future. Tecumseh returned the following year for another council with Harrison in July 1811, but again no agreement was reached. The Shawnee leader made it clear that he would seek British support if necessary to defend native lands. In the fall of 1811, Tecumseh embarked on his most ambitious recruiting mission, traveling south to bring the powerful Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations into his Confederacy. He needed the southern tribes to create a unified front strong enough to challenge American power. While Tecumseh was away, Governor Harrison saw an opportunity to strike at Prophetstown and destroy the growing Confederacy before it could fully form. In November 1811, Harrison led an army of about 1,000 men toward Prophetstown. Tenskwatawa, left in charge and against his brother's explicit instructions to avoid conflict until the Confederacy was complete, allowed himself to be provoked into battle. The prophet assured his warriors that his spiritual power would protect them from American bullets. On November 7, 1811, native warriors attacked Harrison's encampment near the Tippecanoe River in the early morning hours. The Battle of Tippecanoe was fierce but ultimately indecisive. Harrison's forces held their ground and the native warriors withdrew. Harrison then marched to Prophetstown and burned it to the ground, destroying the symbol of Tecumseh's Confederacy. The battle was not a decisive military victory for either side, but it was a devastating political blow to Tecumseh. Tenskwatawa's spiritual authority was shattered when his prophecies of protection proved false, and many followers abandoned the cause. When Tecumseh returned from the south and learned what had happened, he was furious with his brother. The premature battle had undermined years of careful work building the Confederacy. But Tecumseh did not abandon his vision. He continued his efforts to unite the tribes, knowing now that conflict with the Americans was inevitable. The destruction of Prophetstown and the tensions along the frontier contributed to the outbreak of the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain. Tecumseh saw the war as an opportunity. He allied himself and his Confederacy with the British, believing they offered the best hope for checking American expansion and perhaps even creating an independent Native American state in the Northwest Territory. The British, for their part, recognized Tecumseh as a valuable ally who could mobilize significant native forces against the Americans. In the summer of 1812, Tecumseh joined British General Isaac Brock in the campaign against American forces in the Northwest. The alliance between Tecumseh and Brock was remarkably effective. The two men respected each other greatly despite their different backgrounds and cultures. In August 1812, Tecumseh and Brock achieved a stunning victory at Detroit. American General William Hull had invaded Upper Canada with a large army but then retreated to Detroit. Brock and Tecumseh laid siege to the fort. Tecumseh employed psychological warfare, having his warriors repeatedly march past the fort in view of the defenders, creating the impression of a much larger force. Hull, already nervous and indecisive, became convinced he was vastly outnumbered and feared a massacre if the fort was taken by storm. On August 16, 1812, Hull surrendered Detroit and his entire army without firing a shot. It was a humiliating defeat for the Americans and a triumphant moment for Tecumseh and the British. Brock was so impressed with Tecumseh that he reportedly gave the Shawnee leader his own military sash as a token of respect. Tecumseh and Brock seemed poised to roll back American gains in the Northwest. But the partnership was short-lived. In October 1812, Brock was killed at the Battle of Queenstown Heights. His death was a severe blow to Tecumseh, who lost not only an effective military partner but one of the few British officers who genuinely respected native peoples and their goals. Brock's successors were far less sympathetic to Tecumseh and native interests. The new British commander, General Henry Proctor, was cautious, indecisive, and dismissive of his native allies. Nevertheless, Tecumseh continued to fight alongside the British through 1813. In January 1813, a combined British and native force under Proctor and Tecumseh defeated American troops at the Battle of Frenchtown on the River Raisin in Michigan Territory. After the battle, some of Tecumseh's native allies massacred American prisoners, an act that horrified Tecumseh and violated his principles. He was not present during the massacre and condemned it when he learned of it, further demonstrating his commitment to honorable warfare. In the spring of 1813, Tecumseh participated in the siege of Fort Meigs on the Maumee River in Ohio. Despite some tactical successes, Proctor failed to take the fort, and the siege was abandoned. Tecumseh grew increasingly frustrated with Proctor's cautious leadership and unwillingness to take decisive action. The strategic situation deteriorated for the British and their native allies in the summer of 1813. American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British fleet on Lake Erie in September, cutting British supply lines and forcing them to abandon Detroit and retreat into Canada. Tecumseh was disgusted by the British retreat and confronted Proctor, accusing him of cowardice. In a famous speech, Tecumseh compared the British to a fat animal that carries its tail upon its back, but when affrighted, drops it between its legs and runs off. Despite his anger, Tecumseh had no choice but to retreat with the British. He knew that without British support, his Confederacy could not stand alone against American forces. As the British and native forces retreated eastward through Upper Canada along the Thames River, they were pursued by an American army of about 3,500 men commanded by William Henry Harrison, Tecumseh's old adversary. Proctor wanted to continue retreating, but Tecumseh insisted they must make a stand. He told his followers that he had a premonition of his death and asked them to fight bravely. On October 5, 1813, the two forces met at the Battle of the Thames near Moraviantown in Upper Canada. The British forces, outnumbered and demoralized, collapsed quickly under the American assault. Proctor fled the battlefield early in the fighting, abandoning his native allies. Tecumseh and his warriors formed the only effective resistance, fighting fiercely from defensive positions in a swamp and wooded area. The battle was intense but brief. Tecumseh was killed during the fighting, though the exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. Several Americans later claimed to have killed him, but no claim was ever verified. After Tecumseh fell, his warriors, realizing their leader was dead and their cause lost, withdrew from the battlefield. The Americans won a decisive victory. Tecumseh's body was never conclusively identified. His followers reportedly removed his body from the battlefield to prevent desecration, and he was buried in a secret location that has never been discovered. Some American soldiers claim to have found Tecumseh's body and even took strips of skin as souvenirs, but these claims were never proven. The mystery surrounding Tecumseh's final resting place has only added to his legend. With Tecumseh's death, his Confederacy collapsed. Without his unifying vision and charismatic leadership, the alliance of tribes fell apart. The dream of a united Native American nation capable of halting American expansion died with him on that October day in 1813. The War of 1812 continued for another year, but the native peoples of the Northwest had lost their most effective leader and their best hope for preserving their lands. In the decades following the war, the tribes were systematically pushed westward through treaties, military force, and the relentless pressure of American settlement. The vision Tecumseh had fought for, a unified native resistance to American expansion, was never realized. Individual tribes continued to resist, but they could not overcome the demographic and technological advantages of the expanding United States. By the 1840s, most native peoples east of the Mississippi had been removed to lands west of the river, fulfilling Tecumseh's darkest predictions about the fate of his people if they did not unite. Tecumseh's legacy, however, endured far beyond his death. He became a legendary figure, admired even by his enemies for his courage, his principles, and his vision. American officers who fought against him praised his military skills and his humane treatment of prisoners. His refusal to torture or kill captives set him apart from many warriors of his era and earned him respect from both sides. His powerful oratory and his dream of native unity inspired future generations of native leaders. Tecumseh represented the might-have-been of Native American history, the possibility of a different outcome if only the tribes could have overcome their divisions and stood together. He understood earlier and more clearly than most that the native peoples faced a common threat that required a common response. His vision was ultimately ahead of its time, but it was the right vision. The tragedy of Tecumseh was not that his vision was wrong, but that he could not convince enough of his people to embrace it before it was too late. Historians have recognized Tecumseh as one of the most significant Native American leaders, comparing him to figures like Pontiac and Crazy Horse. Unlike leaders who fought for their own tribes alone, Tecumseh fought for all native peoples. He transcended tribal identities to imagine a pan-Indian nation. This made him both visionary and controversial. Many tribal leaders were suspicious of his message and unwilling to surrender their autonomy to a larger confederacy. Some had already accommodated themselves to American power and saw resistance as futile. Others had traditional enmities with tribes Tecumseh was trying to unite. The cultural and linguistic diversity of native peoples, which was a source of richness, also made unity extraordinarily difficult. Tecumseh struggled against these divisions throughout his life, and ultimately they contributed to his failure. But the fact that he came as close as he did to uniting such diverse peoples is a testament to his extraordinary abilities as a leader, diplomat, and visionary. Tecumseh never married or had children, dedicating his entire life to his cause. He lived simply and rejected material wealth, focusing entirely on his mission to save his people. Those who knew him described a man of absolute integrity who lived according to his principles. He opposed alcohol, which he saw as a destructive force among native peoples. He treated enemies with respect and honor. He kept his word and expected others to do the same. These qualities made him an effective leader and earned him loyalty from his followers and respect from his enemies. William Henry Harrison, who fought against Tecumseh for years, called him one of those uncommon geniuses which spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things. This tribute from an adversary speaks to Tecumseh's remarkable character and abilities. Even as Harrison worked to destroy Tecumseh's Confederacy and expand American control over native lands, he recognized the Shawnee leader's greatness. In the years after his death, Tecumseh became an almost mythical figure in American culture. Towns, counties, and landmarks were named after him across the United States and Canada. He appeared in poems, novels, and eventually films as a noble and tragic hero. This romanticization sometimes obscured the real man and his actual goals, but it also ensured that his memory endured. For Native Americans, Tecumseh remains a symbol of resistance, pride, and the dream of unity. His vision of native peoples standing together against colonization and displacement continues to resonate. Modern Native American activists and leaders have invoked Tecumseh's name and example in their own struggles for rights, recognition, and sovereignty. He represents what might have been possible if native peoples had been able to overcome their divisions and present a united front against American expansion. The fact that they could not do so in Tecumseh's time does not diminish his vision or his courage in pursuing it against overwhelming odds. Tecumseh died as he lived, fighting for his people and his vision of their future. He never surrendered, never compromised his principles, and never gave up hope that native peoples could preserve their lands and their way of life. Though his Confederacy died with him and his dream was never realized, his legacy as a leader, warrior, and visionary endures more than 2 centuries after his death. Tecumseh understood that his people faced an existential crisis and that only unity offered hope for survival. He worked tirelessly to build that unity, traveling thousands of miles, delivering countless speeches, and fighting numerous battles in service of his vision. In the end, he failed to achieve his goal, but his failure was not for lack of vision, courage, or effort. The forces arrayed against him were simply too powerful, and the divisions among native peoples too deep to overcome in the time available. Yet Tecumseh's life and death remind us that even in defeat, there can be honor, dignity, and lasting inspiration. He was a man who saw clearly what needed to be done and dedicated everything he had to doing it, knowing the odds were against him but refusing to surrender without a fight.